The last session today here is starting right now. And the name of that session is AI in Responsible Gaming, New Technological Solutions for an Age-Old Problem. We have here Kim Mouridsen, founder of Mindway and professor at Aarhus, also mentioned by Jonas here, University, will explain how technology can be harnessed to make our sector more responsible without burdening each and every occasional player with ever-expanding set of restrictions. Considering the political climate in growing European number of, considering the political climate in a growing number of European jurisdictions, this is quite an important topic. And we've spoken about it before. Kim, how are you? You're in Aarhus.
Thank you,
today,
Willem.
right?
I'm in Aarhus, and I really wish I could be in Berlin, but as I also work at a hospital, this is very difficult to travel at the moment, unfortunately.
You're busy biking, we see, so good. Keep in shape.
I'm trying to. You can only see, from here and down, you cannot see anything, so you don't know how
Okay, true.
the size of my abdomen.
Well, we hope to see you soon then. Kim, over to you. The floor is yours.
Thank you. So very happy to be here. Thank you, Willem, for the invitation. I'd like to start with the next slide, please. So we all know that, next slide, please. We all know that in order to keep a license, it's imperative for operators to be able and also be able to document that they can detect problem gamblers or at-risk gamblers. And we also know that there is an obligation for operators to be able to intervene. So essentially, we are looking for, you could say, a needle in a haystack, but we also at the same time have to be able to explain how we found that needle, because that will be important when we're going to intervene with the customer. Next slide, please. As you can see here, this immediately means that we get sort of a wish list. We have a wish list of, items or capabilities that we would like of a system that's able to help the operators in these pursuits. So first of all, we would like such a system to be automated. If it wasn't automated, it would require too many human resources, and it would also put too much demand, you could say, on the education of these human resources. At the same time, we need such a solution to be highly individualized. So we all know that customers have their own individual playing styles. And therefore, it's important that such a technique can sort of adapt to the way a particular customer is playing. We would also like such a system to invoke state-of-the-art scientific knowledge. We would like it to, as I said, alluded to on the previous slide, we would like it to be explainable. So we don't want any sort of black box solutions where we only can guess what's going on in the system. We would need ideally such a system to be independently developed. So we would like to promote that there's an independence or an arm's length, you could say, between those who actually develop these systems and those who use the systems. And then finally, it would also be ideal in a sense if we could actually externally validate the performance of such a system. So this is really, sort of a best case scenario. Is what are sort of the elements that we would like from such a solution? Next slide, please. This is, on the other hand, really far from where at least most of the operators, that we know from, our experiences. This is really far from, where many of the systems are today. So typically what we see today is that systems are either rule-based, or the newer ones would be based on what we could call artificial intelligence. So the rule-based ones are the really simple ones where, an operator would typically in-house determine a number of rules, and then based on these rules, select customers at risk of problem gambling. And most typically, this would be based on percentages. So, you'd be looking at the top 1% of people, with the highest expenditure in terms of money or in terms of time, for instance. So these are really hard-coded and typically determined by the operator. Now, what we're also seeing is a trend towards, you could say, systems that are based on artificial intelligence. And most of the time, these systems are based on, highly data-driven approaches. And, I would say that there's nothing wrong with a data-driven approach, but the fact is that what they're lacking is essentially a human factor. So there's something that, as we as humans can do when we are assessing, the likelihood of problem gambling for a particular customer that, would go unnoticed for an AI system that's purely based on data. Next slide, please. So, we're looking at either rule-based or AI-based systems where you could say the rule-based, they are ad hoc, they are in-house determined. With AI, you could also say, well, what is it actually we are predicting? Because that's not so hard and fast. We know that we have a powerful technique here, but we're not really sure what it is we are predicting. We know that we are going to predict who's at risk, but then it becomes circular because, who will that actually be? Typically with, as systems are growing in complexity, they have become more and more unable to explain the findings that they are making. And also an important thing is that when artificial intelligence is purely driven by data only, then any biases that we see in such data is going to be inherited by such a system. So again, if we're sort of missing, the human hands-on or the human experience, then we actually run into a number of problems. Next slide, please. And also, you could say for both of these, they don't typically involve state-of-the-art scientific knowledge. They're not tied to, the current developments in the research or in the clinical practice. They're also typically not independent, and rarely do we see that performance has actually been externally validated. This also goes for other suppliers in this same field. Next slide, please. So what artificial intelligence can do, is essentially nothing more than statistics. But where statistics typically rely on aggregated or annotated data, then what artificial intelligence can do is it can take relatively complex or raw or more natural data. Let's say we have an image of a cat here, then given that, this is an image of a cat, we can actually train an AI system to replicate this finding. But the fact is, if you take the next slide, please, that this actually only can happen because there was already a human in the loop. So there was already a human who manually, you could say, labeled this image. So it sort of needs some sort of manual guidance in order for this artificial intelligence system to work. And this is exactly what we're doing with Mindway and the concepts that we have developed here. Next slide, please. Because you can say in responsible gambling, we actually do have a lot of data. We have, spin level data, we have background information, demographic information, and so on. So there's really tons of data and also complex, natural data, but we are actually lacking a little bit of a target here. We are not entirely sure what it is we're going to predict, and that's why I wrote on the earlier slide, what is it we are predicting? How are we using this powerful technology? Next slide, please. This has actually led some operators to look at sort of proxy markers for what can be predicted. And so if you're trying to predict or classify who will become problem gamblers, it could be said to be natural to start by predicting who will self-exclude in the coming period of time, such as 1 month. Because if we assume that self-excluders are excluding because they believe that they are suddenly becoming problem gamblers, well, then it's a reasonable proxy marker. But studies have actually found that it's only 20% of self-defined problem gamblers who actually use self-exclusion. So in that sense, it's an underutilized technique, and therefore it's also going to underestimate the number of problem gamblers. And vice versa, it's only 31% of people who use this technique, so who do self-exclude, who are self-excluding because they believe that they are becoming problem gamblers. So this is actually, and again, as I said in the beginning, if this is purely data-driven, then any biases or problems in the target or the distribution of the data is going to be inherited in the final AI solution. So this is clearly a problem. Next slide, please. The innovation that we have done on a conceptual level in Mindway is that we are bringing back the humans, and we're bringing back the human expertise into this equation. So what we have done is that we have effectively teamed up with a number of problem gambling experts around the world. And in practice, what we do is that we ask these experts to do a sort of a 360-degree evaluation of a single customer. So just as a human was annotating the image of a cat, which of course is relatively easy, then we are essentially asking world-renowned experts to make the same assessment pertaining to problem gambling for individual customers. Next slide, please. Now, what this means is that we have a number of experts, and in our collaborations with individual operators, what we do there is that we sample at random, so there's no bias here. We sample at random a number of customers, and then we present this data in an anonymized fashion, of course, to the experts on our board. And now these experts are typically clinicians, psychologists. They work with problem gamblers. They treat problem gamblers day in and day out. We also have an MD. We have researchers on this team. So we really get different aspects of problem gambling behavior, and we get different flavors of assessment that together cover the whole range of the spectrum of problem gambling. And now, based on the expertise and the knowledge and the routines of these experts, they can then come up with an assessment whether they see in this data, and we are talking about spin level data here. So we're looking at bet by bet, what is the wager, what's the winner, the loss, what type of game was played, when was it played, and then basically look at how this develops over time, over in this case a 3-month period. So really a very fine-grained analysis, manual or analog or expert-based assessment based on fine-grained data. And then they come up with their assessment. And this is where the AI now comes in, because now we have human assessment on the one side, and we have sort of a raw natural data on the other side, and we're going to use AI to combine the two. Next slide, please. So what we have essentially here, and I think if you press one more, that should be an animation. So what we essentially have now, you could say, is a board of psychologists in a box. So we actually now have the combined knowledge of all the experts that we are working with, tailored for a particular operator, such that we can now, in a matter of a few seconds, analyze an entire database from a particular operator in order to make an assessment that we can actually show is in agreement with human expert assessment. Next slide, please. There's the animation. Next slide, please. So that means that effectively now we are patching this up. So essentially now we have this target, we have a well-defined target here, and it's again based on human assessment, human evaluation, and not just, you could say, any human, but really a board of internationally acknowledged experts in the field. So it's their knowledge that we are funneling into this AI system. Next slide, please. Now, since we have a really clear and well-defined target here, we can also talk about what's the performance of such a system. And we have shown that more than 88% of subjects or customers who are manually detected as problem gamblers, so who are identified by these experts, has also been classified as such by the software. So that means that by far most of the manually identified customers, problem gamblers, are also detected by the system. And now vice versa, it's more than 87% of subjects that we detect with our system that could then be confirmed later on to indeed be problem gamblers as assessed by the human experts. So it goes both ways, and we are sort of in the high 80s in terms of agreement. And I don't think we'll ever reach 100, because of course the experts also differ slightly in their opinions and their assessment, which I think is really natural. And of course that's also going to be reflected in the data. Now, importantly, we have actually recently had these results certified or validated, you could say, by Gaming Laboratories International. So we, in collaboration with a particular operator, we simply took anonymized data together with the code, together with the result, showed this to GLI and asked them to, independently assert that, this performance is indeed valid. and they came back and have actually documented this. So this is something that we are really proud of. And it's also something that sort of continues our, you could say scientific tradition, where we are used to being very open and, showing basically our ideas and techniques and results to others for peer review. Next slide, please. What we have also done recently is that we have performed a number of studies that we are coming out with, where we have actually seen what is the reproducibility, you could say, across experts, but also intra-observer or intra-rate of reliability. And in both cases, we have seen that we have a very high degree of reproducibility across operators. Different types of operators, but also within our team of experts. So you can see sort of a graphical illustration of that. The experts are basically scoring risk of problem gambling on a scale from 0 to 100, and you can see that there's actually a very high degree of congruency between several experts. So it's a highly robust system. It's robust across operators, and the performance can be independently validated. Next slide, please. What we offer now is essentially two levels or two views of the data. So in the top, you can imagine that after reading through an entire database and after making its assessment, operators will typically be interested to get sort of a top level view. So we'd be interested in showing what is the distribution. Customers are there with basically a harmless gambling behavior, how many are sort of in an intermediate group, and how many are certainly at high risk of already becoming problem gamblers. Now, this is, really valuable if you're interested in looking at, what's the overall risk profile. It's also very valuable if you're interested in documenting the effect of certain approaches that one might take as an operator. So if there's been a change in marketing, if there's been a change in RD procedures and so on, then you can actually monitor the effect of these on the entire customer cohort or database instantaneously. Now, once the system actually detects a problem gambler, then an operator would typically be interested to go in the other end of the spectrum and then dig out as much information as possible that the system could bring about this particular player. And if we take the next slide, please. Then what we're also able to do is basically explain the decisions that have been made. And this is really unique because the system has been trained on human experts. And as we're training, or as the experts, you could say, are making their assessments, they're not just coming up with an individual risk score. What they do is they actually come up with a rationale and an explanation for why they give the particular rating or score that they do. And that can result in 12, 15 different types of indications. And so since the experts have actually provided these during the training, then they can be re-estimated, you could say, or they can be provided prospectively as the algorithm is running through unseen data. So it means that effectively the AI will not come up just with a risk score, but it will also come up with a, you could say, human-based explanation for the reason why it gave this particular score. And this is something that we have seen is really valuable in subsequent dialogues with individual customers, that an operator is now able to explain why the system finds this particular behavior to be potentially problematic. Next slide, please. As a final note on sort of the applicability of the system, you could say one thing is to make sort of a cross-sectional analysis of a database. But of course, what's really interesting is to monitor customers over time. And that's exactly what we can see in this image. So here, for a duration of about half a year, this customer was monitored. And you can see very clearly how the risk score goes from entirely harmless to something that starts to be a bit of a concern around August. And then in September, you can see that the sort of risk pattern has once again escalated. So this is not only a system that can, make a single analysis. It can be used to track the profile and the risk score for a particular customer, for a cohort of customers. It can actually, and this is the most novel that we are working on right now, a system that can actually predict where a customer trajectory will actually go in a number of months. So imagine that we can actually be able to take data from very early on in this period and then predict, so we could call it predictive AI, what will happen, what will the risk behavior be a couple of months down the line for a particular customer. This is, we think, really valuable in managing customers and mitigating any changes in risk behavior before they actually escalate. Next slide, please.
Kim, Kim, can we leave this at the last slide? Go to the Q&A to answer some of the questions. So we're running slightly over time.
Oh, I wasn't aware. Sorry.
That's what, no problem. And sorry for interrupting. I believe there's quite a few more slides. So as I said before, in the technical compliance session, maybe we should do a webinar and go deeper in some of these items. So before wrapping up, Kim, and please stay here, let's move to some of the questions we've seen in Slido. So again, if you're in Slido, ask your questions or upvote other people's questions. If there's any questions in the room, please raise your hand and we will try to answer these questions. Can we look at Slido, please? And here we are. First question, Kim, and I'm not sure if you can see the questions. Is there self-learning involved in your algorithm?
It's definitely capable of doing self-learning, and I think this is, one of the many advantages of using basically an AI system. I would say that there's sort of two answers to that question, because self-learning is actually also poses the risk that an AI develops bias over time, and therefore it needs to be tightly controlled. So we do have self-learning capabilities in the system, but it's also important to note that the experts will be continuously involved. So, once a half year, for instance, we'll actually do a re-evaluation of the algorithm and then make sure that it still confirms to state of the art and sort of the current knowledge in the field. But yes, the system is able to learn for every, new customer that's run through the system.
Yeah. Thank you, Kim. Second question, I think really interesting. Is it just changes in behavior that are being tracked? Or are you able to recognize certain types of risky players?
That's really an excellent question. And I think, most systems, or at least many systems that, I've personally looked at, they're actually based on detecting changes in behavior. And I think, a change in the behavior obviously not necessarily is really bad. So I think that such a system is going to give a lot of, false positives in a sense. So what we do, and this is again because we're really working with experts here who can see through not the changes, but can actually sort of just by seeing a trajectory over a couple of months for a particular customer, can give an assessment, absolutely speaking, whether this looks like problem gambling or not. So in that sense, the AI then also becomes absolute. It's not dependent on identifying changes in the behavior. It's really dependent on the experts being able to do this segmentation, if you will. And one way that we are using this is that we take it one step further and say for a particular customer with a particular profile, and remember this is explainable in the sense that we have different indications coming up for each problem gambler. That more or less corresponds to what you're asking, if there are different types of players. So yes, that's exactly where they're coming from.
Yeah.
That also means that the intervention should be adapted to that type of customer or type of player. And so what we also do is that we supply conversation scripts, you could say, that are automatically generated based on the AI and can then be used in an individualized communication with the end user.
Thank you, Kim. Moving to the last question here for today. Are there aspects in which AI can outperform humans in identifying risky playing behavior. And that person is not referring to volume cost effectiveness here.
Yeah. Also an excellent question and something that we would really like to do. And I think the answer actually in one of the last slides. So if you remember back to this slide where we showed risk behavior over time. So what we're actually doing there is we are predicting expert assessment in the future. So we're actually making a prediction on today's data where the customer will be in terms of risk level, let's say 3 months from now. And this is really an exercise where I think that AI has a good chance of outperforming experts, because an expert can basically make an assessment on, let's say, today's data. But it's going to become increasingly difficult to make a prediction where the customer is going to be in 3 months. Yeah. On the other hand, the AI can basically, you could say, synthesize data from thousands of players where this trajectory is known, and then learn basically from the patterns that it's seeing. And in that sense, I think that the AI will be able to outperform, even experts in the future. Incidentally, something that we have also seen in another field where we're also active, namely in radiology, where we are now seeing that AI can actually interpret medical images in some sense better than radiology.
Yeah. Great, Kim. I would like to conclude with this answer, your contribution here today. Thank you so much for joining us, and hopefully see you next year live here in Berlin. Thank you, Kim.
I really hope so. Thank you, Willem. Thank you, guys.